Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about why single joint exercises are not particularly trainable and why we should change them fairly often. It's something that people have asked me about because I've mentioned it briefly over time in videos, and I've said, look, they're not really trainable. And it doesn't mean we don't do them. It doesn't mean we don't use them. I mean, I do plenty of single joint exercises, right? The problem we have, though, with single joint exercises that put most of the emphasis on a single muscle. Because some single joint exercises really spread the load across multiple large muscles, right? I mean, a good morning is basically a single joint exercise. So when we're talking about single joint, we're generally talking about something like some sort of leg curl, some sort of bicep curl, a tricep extension that doesn't use much shoulder, things like that, right? A lateral raise. Right, these are traditionally what we're thinking of as single joint. These are what we're thinking of as single joint, not necessarily something like the hip joint, because that's technically a single joint. But again, we have multiple very large muscles all involved as primary movers. So that tends to be different. So when we're talking about single joint movements that put the majority on the load on one muscle, such as the bicep, the hamstring, the side delt, right, something like that, they're not particularly trainable. What do I mean by trainable? The ability to progress over a period of time. It doesn't mean that you can't do them. I mean, you're getting a stimulus in it if you take it to fatigue or take it to failure, right? We know that. That's a given. And a muscle will grow as a result of that. When I say they're not trainable, we don't really make real progression, right? You'll see progression for a very short time and then it'll stall. And you won't see any meaningful progression on that lift for a very, very long time. And why is that? Well, because there's no real intramuscular coordination going on, right? There's a little bit of a neural response at first. We usually get a little stronger at that lift when we first start doing it. Or if we're kind of a noob or it's an underdeveloped muscle, sometimes we'll see a pretty rapid increase in strength on that muscle if we're not used to using it in a single joint manner. But it's very, very short-lived. And then after that, any change you get in the weight that you can use, assuming you're not cheating, assuming you're not using any sort of form or momentum or outside force, it's going to come directly from hypertrophy. Well, muscles grow slow. Okay, muscle building is a very, very slow process. Most of us know this. People will say something like, oh, this person hasn't changed in a long time. Well, yeah, because they've already built a base. All right, people don't make quick changes in muscle tissue without copious amounts of drugs. Unless they're a noob, or unless they've detrained and they've lost a bunch of muscle. Right? You spend 6 months not training as an advanced lifter, you're going to gain muscle again really fast. But barring those situations, muscle growth is a slow process. And so if you're doing a strict concentration curl, and you're able to get 12 reps with a 30-pound dumbbell, and you've built up to that, right? You've been using that, and that's basically your 12 rep max. You hit failure around rep 12 or 13 after having done it for several weeks. You realize that to go to a 35-pound dumbbell, it might take you 6 months. It might take you 9 months. It might take you a year. And I'm not talking about when you cheat, because a lot of times we use momentum and cheat just to be able to use a heavier dumbbell. But on a strict movement, like you're down into a concentration curl and you're not swinging at all, no, it could take you a very, very, very long time to add 5 pounds on that dumbbell. And that's probably going to be corresponding with, a significant amount of muscle growth. And that takes time. So they're not particularly trainable. And that's what I mean by trainable. You're not going to add a bunch of reps, or you're not going to increase the weight 10% once you've gotten used to doing the exercise. It's just not going to happen. Therefore, we don't get that same training that we would want from it. The other downside, single joint exercises actually can be very prone to overuse. Okay? If you want to have inflammation of tendons, do a single joint exercise that rubs a tendon in kind of a bad situation, and do large volumes of the exact same movement pattern over and over and over for months on end, and then watch how much tendon inflammation you get. Okay? Therefore, it would behoove us to rotate these movements fairly often. And we would do that for a number of reasons. Number one, alleviate boredom. Because when we're not seeing progress on something, what happens? We get upset with it, we get bored with it, we don't want to be consistent with it. That happens. There's a psychological response. There's also that tendency to take that single joint movement and start cheating more and more just so we feel like we're making progress on it. Okay? So psychologically, once it's been stalled a little while, you might be wise to just change it out for something else so that you can do something that you can make a little bit of progress on and feel like you were making progress. And as funny as that sounds, it's not always about just the progress that we are making. It's feeling like we're making progress. Because muscle growth is very subjective. Your brain will play tricks on you and how a muscle looks. Okay? But performance is less subjective. Therefore, it kind of removes that, because that can be a hang-up for a lot of us. The other thing to think about, the overuse issue, especially with a really strict single joint type movement. Rotate it out. Spend a few weeks pushing it really hard and change to a different sort of curl. Change to a different tricep extension. And it doesn't have to be dramatically different, right? You could change from a dumbbell to a chain. You could switch from a straight bar to an easy curl bar. You could change your grip angle. Okay? You could change from an easy curl bar to a dumbbell and do the same movement pattern. It's going to balance a little different. The range of motion, the angles will be slightly different. Well, that gives us some benefits, doesn't it? Number one, we might get a novel training response from it. We might get a novel training response. And it might stimulate a little bit extra growth. Maybe we do hit a few muscle fibers slightly differently than we have been doing. We get a novel training response and maybe get a microscopic, non-visible amount of extra muscle. But, the novel training response. And again, possibly working the muscle in some slightly different areas than we have been. Maybe some of the muscle fibers haven't been recruited as effectively. They're underdeveloped. We kind of spark some new development. There's that possibility, and I'm not saying it's going to happen. But there's the possibility of it happening. Number two, we're changing the movement pattern around. We're changing the way tendons rub against bones and things, because that's a lot of our overuse, isn't it? Connective tissue inflammation. It's just the way tendons get rubbed and pulled against things sometimes at certain angles, particularly unnatural angles. A lot of times smaller movements are a very unnatural movement for us. And they can irritate tendons. Okay, they can cause inflammation there. And if we just change the loading, and it can be as simple as some little small movement you're doing, just changing from a dumbbell to an easy curl bar. Right? Just switching what you're using, switching from a cable to a dumbbell. Switch into bands. Totally changes that. And it will change the way the tendons and things rub. It'll kind of change the stress where they get put on things where they're rubbing against other harder tissue and things like that. We'll reduce that inflammation. We'll reduce that chance of overuse injuries. Right? The other thing to think about, there are very few there's no negatives to it. Because smaller movements, smaller single joint movements are not particularly trainable. Right? They're not particularly trainable. That means if we switch to just a similar movement pattern, we're not getting any less stimulation. Okay? If you're used to curling with a dumbbell already in a single joint manner, you're not going to lose stimulation if you go over to an easy curl bar. Okay? As long as you're taking those sets close to failure or reaching muscle failure, you're going to get just as much stimulation. It's not like there's a big new movement pattern you have to learn. Okay? You could literally change your single joint exercises every time you train. You could do a different curl every workout. 5 workouts in a row. 5 upper body workouts in a row. Right? You could change it around, and you know what? You're still going to get a pretty similar training response as long as the amount of fatigue the muscle is subjected to is similar. And that would actually be perfectly reasonable also. It's not about the whole bodybuilder muscle confusion thing. It's about the fact that there's just not that much difference. Right? There's just not that much difference in terms of the muscle stimulation. And with those smaller movements, fatigue is fatigue. All that muscle knows is tension and fatigue. Okay, at the level of the muscle fiber and how much force it's having to exert and how many fibers are exhausting themselves. That's all it knows. So the training response itself at the muscular level is pretty similar. But your brain might appreciate the change in staleness. Your connective tissue might appreciate the different movement in terms of overuse and inflammation. So you could absolutely do that and you would be perfectly fine. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.